We're a few days into January, looking ahead to 2025. What is on your radar of things that may be coming out this year that you are looking forward to listening to and hearing for the first time?
Man, I think it's going to be a good year. I think there's going to be some interesting stuff. Uh, I've been reading up on some of the albums that are coming up in this year. There are a few that are like slated to come out soon. One of which is a band called Squid, and they have their album called Cowards coming out on February 7th. That's going to be interesting. It's going to be their third studio album. They're this band from Brighton, England, kind of they were kind of started off a little bit later than some of the other like post-punk bands in England, like a little bit after Fontaines DC or Shame or some of those bands, but they were kind of lumped in with that sort of post-punk label. But I think that they really always do interesting stuff, so I'm looking forward to that. There's a single for a song called Crispy Skin that they have already released from that album. That's going to be good. There's another artist that I think that you'd really enjoy named Barty Strange, and the album's going to be called Horror, and that's on February 14th. That's on Valentine's Day. He's based out of DC. He was like born in England, grew up on the West Coast, but really sort of a genre bending artist, indie pop, like hip hop, jazz. He was a guitar player. You can listen to 3 songs off of that new album, and there's one called Sober from Barty Strange that I really like. That's kind of gotten me excited for that album. The 2 others that are like on the books that I'm really looking forward to. The first is a band called Murder Capital. The album's going to be called Blindness on February 21st. They came out again. I referenced these same set of like English, or not English, but British bands. And they actually came out at the same time as this other Irish band, this other band from Dublin. And that's Fontaines DC, and the Murder Capital was around the same time. But they have this like really brooding, sort of intense thing going on, especially on their debut. But that debut, what was it? When I Have Fears. It was a really good album. And then their sophomore album was Gigi's Recovery. That was really, really good. Only Good Things and 1,000 Lives. Those are 2 songs off that album I would highly recommend, but they were in big rotation for me back in 2023. So been a couple years for Murder Capital. I'm excited about their return. And then I don't know, that probably the most well-known of these bands that I'm talking to you about is a band called Japanese Breakfast. I don't know if you've heard of Japanese Breakfast before, but they have an album coming out on March 21st called From Melancholy. I'll have to look at my notes here. For Melancholy Brunettes and Sad Women. Uh, Japanese Breakfast has been around for a long time. A long time, I say. Like, I don't know, maybe 10 years, but I think their first album came out maybe in 2016. I found them around 2017 when I first heard their single Roadhead, which I thought was a great title but the album I ended up getting into, and it was Soft Sounds from Another Planet. But gosh, there's so many good songs on that album. Diving Woman, Boyish. Their latest album, it was back in 2021 called Jubilee, won a Grammy. And I think you would really like some Japanese Breakfast. You get everything from like a little bit of like, there's some occasional like Andrew Bird kind of vibes on like, there's a song called Kokomo, Indiana that kind of reminds me of that. And then sort of more atmospheric synth pop. Like, I don't know if you're as familiar with a band called Beach House, but I like kind of Beach House vibes, but they're just kind of really unique. I could try to draw parallels with other bands, but they're really, the lead singer and like songwriter Michelle Zauner's really good. They have sort of a shoegazy, what would you call it? What do they call that? Chamber pop sort of sound, and that's really good. So their latest single, Orlando in Love, I think it's called. That's out. I was listening to that. So those are really like the ones that I know are on the books that are coming up in the next few months. But then there's some other ones that you and I listen to, like now some of the bands that we're into that are like potentially having albums coming out. And I think the first one is LCD Sound System. They haven't had one that came out since American Dream in 2017. So this would be, it's like an 8-year gap, but they had a single that came out at the end of 2024 called X-Ray Eyes. That's good. And there was sort of this false news story that went around that they were gonna, it's fake news, that they were gonna be coming out with an album, Primavera Sound Barcelona, but I guess that's not true. Anyway, I still think it's possible we get an LCD Sound System album. There's rumors that Gorillaz might come out with an album in 2025. I think that would be super cool. There's also like this long-standing rumor that anytime now Pulp is going to come out with a new album, and it's been ages since Pulp's had new music. So I would really be excited to hear that. But I'm a big Pulp fan. One of the bands I talk about a lot is Shame, and that's another sort of younger band from England. And I was just talking to someone about like, I need some more Shame music in my life. Like I haven't heard from these guys in a couple of years now, since their last album, Food for Worms, which was really good. They've had 3 albums. They've all been good albums. And they just posted some stuff on one of their social media accounts that they just finished recording an album. So I haven't seen any news stories on that. That's just from the band themselves. I think that was in December of 2024. They said that they were finished recording. So I'm hopeful that I get a new Shame album. I don't know if you've ever listened to much Viagra Boys, but I saw them tour in Nashville with Shame. They were kind of sort of like co-headliners. It was an amazing show at Brooklyn Bowl. But dude, Viagra Boys were so good, and that's such a good live album. But just a fun band, like fun music. Their last album, Cave World, was amazing. I don't know. That's
What's
more of a
their
fingers
music like?
crossed. So
How
their
would you
music is
describe
like,
them?
it's like dancey electronic punk. It's like if you take some of the LCD Sound System that's like at its most jagged and kind of like gnarly, but you mix in some. If I tell you what you should do is go listen to. I mean, I could give you a couple that I really like Attention Deficit Disorder, ADD. Go listen to that. That's just like this amazing song off of Cave World. But the first song I ever heard from them, that I think is probably the first song a lot of people have heard, is just called Sports. And go listen to Sports, and you'll get a good sense of their sense of humor. It's just, the lyrics are hilarious. But Viagra Boys put on a great show, but I also love their albums. They have a good growing fan base too. So I would be, I would think in the next year or two we might get another Viagra Boys album. And what a name too for a band, to just be ballsy enough to call yourself Viagra Boys. So those are some of the albums and the artists that I'm looking forward to hearing from in the upcoming year. I think it's going to be a pretty good year, actually.
That's awesome. So, I know your taste is always evolving, but if you had to describe, okay, here's, and I feel like you described Viagra Boys sound well, but if you were saying, okay, here's the kind of sound or style that really, that I'm drawn to, how would you describe, like, this is what my favorite style and recipe is?
It's a great question. I think the thing that is most compelling to me over the last several years are guitar bands from, they don't have to be from England. It's just coincidental that they are. They're not all from England. There's some really good ones from the US and from Europe too. But I think there's a really good movement of bands that are, they get called post punk, right? And post punk is really this movement of music that happened in the wake of the original punk wave, like back in the 70s. And anything that, it's almost like, if you think of blues and how you listen to a lot of rock that came out in the late 60s or early 70s, right? And you look at what they were doing in like the British invasion, and you kind of have like, I tend to think like a lot of rock and roll has like a blues base, like a Zeppelin has like a blues. It's like if this were a barbecue sauce instead of a tomato base, like this is like a blues base. And then there's this whole other subset of artists who have like a punk base. So it's like they don't really, calling them a punk band is not really accurate. So I think people use that term post punk probably overuse it. It's probably to the extent of like indie music, where it's like this could mean a lot of stuff right now. But I do think that a lot of what I like could be categorized as post punk really broadly. But I do think there's some really interesting guitar bands that have come out of England, especially, but again, a lot of other places. In I really started to come onto my radar in like 2017, 2018. And it's funny because there's this real big narrative out there that like rock and roll is dead, and guitar bands aren't a thing anymore. And I do think it's less so in the US. I think we have some really good bands over here too, but I think that right now there's been a movement over the last several years of bands that have often two guitarists both doing very interesting things. Uh, uh, a great lyricist or an interesting front man doing something that is, I mean, I wouldn't say that anything that these bands are doing are like reinventing the wheel necessarily, but they just make interesting choices. They're energetic. You don't get bored when you listen to them. They're always evolving with each album. Idols is a great example. I feel like it's a trifecta that I usually talk about, which is like Idols, Shame, and Fontaines DC, and they all share that. Two guitarists, an interesting front man with good energy and just sort of propulsive music that is really driving. Like that's the stuff that I am drawn to the most, and it's why those bands are now like on my radar. It's like anytime they're coming out with something, and it's funny, like I remember finding those bands in 2017, 2018, and I was like, I think I'm connecting with some newer bands. It had been a few years. I was kind of on a dry spell of finding new bands. And then in 2018, I'm like, okay, I'm connecting with new bands. And in my head, they're all still new bands. But when you look at it now, it's like, okay, we're actually getting to the point where these bands have been around for a while. They're in their third, fourth album at this point. So it's like they're not new bands anymore, but they're still, I think, in their prime. And I think it's exciting to listen to bands when they're either just getting started or they're like clicking on all cylinders and they're in their prime. And I think all those bands that I've been talking about really fit into that category.